My family banned me from the family business, then found out I controlled their contracts. The last time I stood in front of the Nilsson and Hart headquarters was 6 years ago, holding a presentation folder still warm from the printer. I had barely slept, partly because I was perfecting every line of the pitch, and partly because I knew this was more than a career milestone. It was legacy. My grandfather co-founded the company in the late 62nd, and my mother spent most of her life trying to prove she belonged in a boardroom full of men who always called her the exception. I thought if I worked twice as hard, studied twice as long, and stayed quiet just long enough, I might be seen as more than just a courtesy hire. I was wrong. My name is Ingrid Nilsson. I'm 34 now. I live in Chicago and run a private analytics firm focused on risk modeling for urban infrastructure. But before that, I was just Monica's niece, the quiet one. The overachiever who always brought printouts to family dinners and accidentally used corporate vocabulary at weddings. The girl who at 28 designed a proposal that helped the company secure a federal transportation contract worth $260 million. I was never supposed to lead the project, just draft the back-end logistics. But when the contract was announced and Monica took the stage with Caleb, our CFO, I realized I was never going to be allowed anywhere near the podium. My name wasn't mentioned once. The moment that shifted everything didn't happen on stage. It happened 3 days later when I opened a sealed envelope slid under my office door. A single sheet. No greeting, no signature. Just a typed line in bold. Effective immediately, your role in Project Compass has been reassigned to internal stakeholders more suited for public representation. The sentence read like legalese, but I heard what it meant loud and clear. You don't look like leadership. You don't sound like legacy. You're useful, but not visible. I didn't cry. Not right away. I didn't scream or demand a meeting. I sat at my desk with the lights off until the janitor asked if I was still working. Then I packed my things into a small bag, just the laptop I brought from grad school, a coffee mug from my intern days, and a rejection email I printed without knowing why. I told HR I'd take unpaid leave for the quarter, and they didn't even ask why. I walked out of that building with a sense of silence I'd never known. It wasn't defeat. It was stillness. The kind that comes when you realize no one's going to save you from a system that was never built for you in the first place. What no one knew was that while Monica celebrated her 7th consecutive quarter as chairwoman and Caleb polished his LinkedIn with fake metrics, I was watching. I had already started consulting for a small city council in Indiana on traffic flow optimization. It paid just enough to cover rent. I had no team, no capital, no brand. Just one idea I couldn't let go of: if the infrastructure fails at the root, then power can be rebuilt from the data outward. And unlike family, legacy data doesn't lie. 6 months after I left, Nilsson and Hart Monica sent me a Thanksgiving card. It was short, clearly written by an assistant, and closed with the words, "We wish you the best in your next steps." She meant it as a brush-off. A graceful end to what she saw as a failed trial. But I read it again and again. I never replied, not with words. I started working nights teaching myself systems compliance, learning how vendors negotiated behind closed doors. I studied their language, not just the jargon, but the tempo, the way they talked about risk when they thought no one was listening. I wasn't building a business yet, I was building vocabulary. The kind of vocabulary that gets you into rooms legacy alone never could. What no one at Nilsson and Hart realized is that while they were diversifying by optics, I was diversifying by structure. While they chased headlines, I chased algorithms. While they called me not quite there, I embedded myself inside the very digital arteries they were unknowingly contracting out. And while Caleb and Jasper took credit for operational overhauls, they didn't even understand I was already outlining the foundation for something else. Something mine. That was 6 years ago. I hadn't seen Caleb or Monica since, until last month when a meeting invitation landed in my inbox. Subject line: Strategic Renewal Session, Contract Partners. Location: Nilsson and Hart HQ, 42nd floor boardroom. The same room where I had once stood, with a folder and a dream. I clicked accept. You know that feeling when you walk into a space that once broke you, and it no longer holds the power to even shake you? That's what stepping off the elevator felt like. The receptionist didn't recognize me. That made me smile. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one they've already forgotten. I adjusted my blazer and walked past the glass doors as the meeting began. Caleb looked up confused. Monica blinked twice. Neither of them spoke, because the truth was already in the numbers. They just hadn't realized who put them there. When I stepped into that boardroom, I didn't expect a parade. I didn't even expect a nod. But what caught me off guard was how little anyone recognized me. 6 years, 6 award cycles, 6 Christmas cards signed with names that had once belonged to my mentors. None of them remembered the girl with the folder. And maybe that was my first real win, because being underestimated was the only currency they never learned to value. The meeting began like most corporate summits, espresso machines, humming in the corner, a half-hearted welcome from Jasper Hart, who still insisted on reading from printed notes, and Caleb flashing through charts like he'd built the data pipeline himself. I stood near the back with my team quiet and deliberate, not as a participant but as a guest of Orion Systems, one of Nilsson and Hart's most reliable digital vendors. What none of them knew was that Orion had never been just a vendor. It had been mine since the first invoice. Every server they trusted, every compliance platform they renewed, every emergency patch they requested at 2 in the morning had passed through my team's hands first. It started small. The city contract in Indiana had led to another in St. Louis, then Charlotte, then Phoenix. Each time we optimized one layer deeper than expected, monitoring traffic patterns, flagging infrastructure vulnerabilities, helping agencies reduce procurement waste. But while we helped cities streamline operations, we also tracked who their contractors were. Nilsson and Hart came up often. Quiet, consistent, profitable, and deeply flawed. Their logistics division hadn't updated its risk compliance software in 4 years. Their regional reporting teams used outdated dashboards prone to inflating volume metrics. Their vendor audits were templated to the point of negligence. I didn't set out to exploit that. At first I just noted it. But when I realized how much of their growth relied on being perceived as ahead of the curve, while relying on patchwork systems we controlled, I stopped observing and started building leverage. My lawyer Dion Carter helped me build layers of legal insulation. Orion was one of 3 shell firms under a parent company based in Vancouver, staffed by engineers I recruited during my nights as a freelancer. We never used our real names. All contracts were handled through encrypted platforms. Orion's public face was a mid-level CTO named Emery, a friend from grad school who never attended a single client dinner, but always signed the deals. Meanwhile, Silas Nguyen, my systems architect, monitored Nilsson and Hart's backend from a co-working space in Minneapolis, logging every failed patch, every manual override, every gap in financial reporting. We didn't plan sabotage. We collected proof. Still, there were days I doubted the point of it all. When my mother called to ask why I hadn't RSVP'd to the New Year's dinner. When my old coworkers shared LinkedIn posts praising Caleb's transformative leadership and Monica's trailblazing vision. When I walked past billboards that used phrases I'd written in old brand decks now repurposed without my name, I wanted to scream. But instead, I studied their supply chain. Last year, we submitted a routine infrastructure platform upgrade request that should have triggered internal review. It was buried for 3 weeks. When finally flagged, Caleb authorized it without escalation, not realizing it would redirect all performance analytics through a shadow monitoring layer. We didn't alter the data, we just watched it in real time. And what we saw confirmed what I suspected. Overstated metrics. Redacted vendor logs. Deferred spending listed as active capital. Jasper had become a figurehead with no operational insight. Monica attended less than half of her scheduled meetings. Caleb managed everything by charm and bluff. If a regulator audited their back end, the company wouldn't survive a month. So when the annual contract renewal invitation came, I didn't hesitate. I told Dion to accept. I told Silas to prepare the risk memo. I told myself to stay composed. And I told no one else. Because timing matters. Not just in revenge, but in proof. They thought I was there to discuss digital upgrades. In truth, I was there to measure how deep their dependence had grown. When Caleb projected Orion's contract value for the fiscal year, he didn't realize he was showing me my own power. 82% of their infrastructure compliance now relied on systems we controlled. 64% of their audit flags were resolved through our platforms. And in the last 3 quarters, every single new government contract they'd secured had been routed through a software stack we maintained. I watched Monica nod, along with his numbers, wearing the same burgundy lipstick I remembered from childhood. She looked calm, polished, the matriarch. But her empire stood on scaffolding I had designed. And no one had taught her what to do when the scaffolding pulled itself away. At the end of the presentation, I stepped forward for the first time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show them my hand. I simply said, "Before we move forward with the renewal, there are a few operational inconsistencies we'd like to clarify." Caleb froze mid-click. Monica tilted her head slightly confused, and that was all I needed. The silence after my question was almost clinical. I had asked about operational inconsistencies not as an accusation but as an observation. That tone mattered. In rooms like that, power rarely shouts. It moves by asking questions no one wants to answer. Caleb leaned slightly forward, blinking, as if hoping someone else might speak first. Monica kept her posture sharp, but her fingertips tapped once, twice against the side of her coffee cup. I kept my expression neutral, glancing briefly at my tablet, like this was just another meeting, but underneath I was listening to the air shift. I had learned long ago that the first few seconds of uncertainty are where leverage begins to take root. Caleb cleared his throat and mumbled something about vendor redundancy, followed by an awkward laugh that trailed off before anyone could join in. I didn't correct him. I let him speak. The worst thing you can do to someone who's built their entire career on bluffing is give them rope. Silas had been watching this exact moment from the floor below, running a live cross-check on every statement Caleb made. By the time he stammered out his third half-answer, I received a ping on my device confirming at least 2 discrepancies in the numbers. I didn't need them yet, I just needed to know they were real. When the meeting finally adjourned for lunch, I didn't eat. I walked out of the building, took a long loop around the block and called Dion. She didn't say hello, she just asked. "Is it time?" I said, "Not yet, but close." There's something about knowing you could destroy something, and choosing not to that creates its own kind of pressure. I didn't want revenge. I wanted control. And control when used well doesn't explode. It surrounds. That afternoon I requested a private follow-up with Jasper and Monica. The request was granted partly because they still underestimated the depth of what I knew, and partly because Monica hated looking unprepared in public. Behind closed doors, she dropped the polished tone and asked what exactly I was trying to suggest. I didn't suggest anything. I showed her the summary report from our compliance tool, formatted with their branding, but watermarked faintly with our seal. It highlighted irregular timing in approvals, missing audit trails, and unexplained revenue smoothing across fiscal quarters. I didn't accuse Caleb directly. I simply asked, "Are you aware this has been happening?" Monica's response was predictable. She blinked twice, sat back and said she would have her team review it. Jasper stayed quiet. That night I flew home. I didn't sleep much, not because of nerves, but because I was writing the internal memo that would trigger the second phase. By morning, Dion had filed it through our offshore partner, triggering a contract clause. Most vendors never even realize exists the material integrity clause. It gave us the right to request an independent audit before any renewal, not as punishment but as protocol. When the formal request hit their inbox, I imagined Monica's face. She would recognize the tone, the language, the clean edges of the formatting. It mirrored the very memos I used to draft for her team. The irony wouldn't be lost on her. 2 days later, Caleb called me directly. His voice tried to sound firm, but the edges wobbled. He asked if we could handle this internally and offered to loop in their legal team for a mediated discussion. I declined politely. I told him the clause was standard across all our contracts. I reminded him this wasn't about people, it was about systems. That line quieted him. Systems had always been his blind spot. He excelled in personality, in the art of managing perception. But he never respected the pipeline that fed the perception. And now, it was the pipeline that would undo him. A week passed. The audit began. Silas and 3 others were flown in under the guise of external consultants. Every file they touched had already been mapped in shadow weeks prior. We weren't looking for clues. We were documenting what we already knew. That's a different kind of audit, one where the report is more like a mirror than a searchlight. By the second day, whispers began circulating inside their team. People noticed the questions were too specific, the timestamps too precise. Monica called Jasper into her office for back-to-back meetings. Meanwhile, Caleb stopped showing up altogether. He claimed illness. I believed him. Guilt has a way of making the body fragile. 3 nights into the audit, I got a text from Dion. It was a screenshot of a quiet admission buried inside a Slack thread between 2 junior analysts on the Nilsson team. It read, "I think someone set this up. Like a long time ago." I stared at that line for a long time. Because they were right. I had set it up, not out of malice, not to hurt anyone. I had simply chosen not to disappear. I had chosen to build something stronger than their approval. That same night, I drafted a second memo. This one was simpler. It was titled Terms of Strategic Withdrawal, and it outlined the cost of exit if Orion decided not to renew its contract. It wasn't a threat. It was math. And math, like memory, doesn't flinch. The morning the audit results were due, I arrived early. Not out of nerves, but precision. Control is clearest at the edge of chaos, and timing sharpens it like glass. I wore a slate gray suit, no jewelry, no distractions. The kind of outfit that lets other people project their assumptions while you hold the real weight in silence. Monica and Jasper arrived minutes later, followed by the 2 external board members and a federal oversight consultant who, until that morning, didn't know how exposed their numbers truly were. I greeted them with a calm nod, nothing more. In meetings like this, posture speaks before words do. Dion joined me at the head of the table. She didn't bring a briefcase, just a small black folder closed by a single clasp. It contained 3 documents. One was the independent audit summary. One was the terms of withdrawal. The third was an outline of conditional restructuring, something I had drafted, not out of hope, but because control isn't just knowing when to walk away. It's knowing when to give people a way to save face if you let them. The audit summary was direct. No embellishment, no threats. Just numbers that showed a company long celebrated for stability was in fact operating on a thin veneer of projected confidence patched together by outdated tools and financial manipulation, so subtle it had taken my team 6 months to verify every layer. Caleb's role in inflating operational forecasts was clearly mapped. Jasper's passivity was documented. Monica's oversight failures were noted, with timestamps, forwarded emails, and missing signatures. It wasn't personal. It was structural. And structure always reveals the shape of what's been hidden. When Dion slid the report across the table, Monica didn't touch it at first. She glanced at the cover, then at me, and I could see something shift behind her eyes. Not fear, not anger, recognition. It's a strange thing to watch someone realize that the person they thought had disappeared was not only present but orchestrating the moment they now found themselves in. Jasper stayed quiet. One of the board members, a man named Kendrick, who had been with the company since my grandfather's era, cleared his throat and asked whether this level of dependency on a single vendor was intentional or accidental. No one answered. Because there wasn't a safe answer. Dion opened the folder and placed the second document on the table. The terms of withdrawal were clear. If Orion Systems ended its contracts, Nilsson and Hart would lose access to over 70% of its compliance infrastructure, 42% of its digital platforms, and all pending upgrades required for federal eligibility in May Sute, the next quarter. The gap couldn't be filled in under a year, and without that eligibility, their top 3 government contracts would lapse within 90 days. Monica scanned the numbers slowly. Jasper finally spoke, asking if this was blackmail. I responded evenly. It's math. And a mirror. You just weren't looking. Silas had projected the final slide, a network visualization of Nilsson and Hart's digital ecosystem. Orion Systems sat at the center, silent and invisible but undeniably essential. Every touchpoint lit up in response to a request. Every contract ID had a timestamp. The truth wasn't emotional, it was operational. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. I offered the third document only after a full minute of silence. Conditional restructuring. If accepted, Monica would step down as chair, Jasper would be reassigned to a non-voting advisory role, and the board would appoint an independent transition team for 90 days, during which my team would oversee stabilization and long-term compliance reforms. If declined, all contracts would be terminated within 5 business days, and our findings would be forwarded to the Office of Federal Procurement Integrity. No threat, just sequence. Monica didn't reach for the paper. Instead, she looked at me and asked one question I hadn't anticipated. "Why didn't you just burn us down?" I looked at her and said what I knew to be true. Because this was never about proving I was right. It was about making sure the wrong people didn't keep pretending they were. Jasper lowered his eyes. Kendrick nodded almost imperceptibly. Sometimes the oldest people in the room are the first to recognize the quietest kind of truth. By noon, the vote was unanimous. The restructuring would proceed. Monica asked for a day to announce her resignation internally. I agreed. Because power is not just about what you take. It's also about what you let people keep when it no longer threatens you. As we walked out, Dion asked me if I felt victorious. I said no. I felt aligned. And in that alignment, I understood something no one in that building ever taught me: when the system denies you visibility, the real win is becoming the thing it depends on without realizing it. Monica's resignation went public 3 days later in a press release that read like every other leadership transition for strategic alignment. No hint of what had actually happened. No mention of audit findings or federal compliance breaches, or the private vote that made it clear she no longer had control. Just the language of preservation carefully chosen to avoid panic. Jasper's title shifted to Senior Strategic Advisor, which in corporate terms meant he'd stay around long enough to hand off whatever legacy hadn't yet unraveled. Caleb, notably, was absent from every communication. His resignation had been submitted quietly and accepted without comment. The collapse, as I had always suspected, would not arrive with a bang. It would arrive with silence. That week, I moved my workspace into the transitional suite they assigned me on the 36th floor. It wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. The floor sat between legacy operations and compliance restructuring, and I wanted proximity to both. I didn't redecorate. I didn't bring in plants or framed quotes or nostalgic tokens from the past. Just my laptop, my notes, and a printout of the original rejection letter Monica had sent me 6 years ago. I didn't pin it up. I didn't need to. It wasn't for looking at. It was for remembering. Over the next 2 weeks, the shift began slowly. Staff meetings were quieter. People looked over their shoulders more often. One assistant asked if I preferred to be called ma'am or director. I told her to use my name. That didn't relax her, and I understood why. The idea of me had shifted. I wasn't just the niece who had once handed out coffee during quarterly briefings. I was now the architect behind the system that had quietly unseated their leadership. That kind of shift doesn't just change seating charts, it changes the oxygen in the room. Some people tried to win favor early. They dropped into my office with thin smiles and long compliments. I didn't push them away, but I didn't open the door either. I knew who had laughed when I left. Who had forwarded my pitch decks without attribution? Who had once told me that legacy can't be learned, only inherited? They were quieter now. Not out of fear, but because they finally understood that merit doesn't knock loudly. It builds the floor you're standing on. Silas stayed remote during the transition. He didn't need to be seen. His job was done. Dion, on the other hand, moved into an adjacent suite and began preparing the permanent compliance protocols for board approval. Watching her move through those meetings with calm, ruthless clarity reminded me that power is often quiet because it doesn't seek applause. It simply replaces what fails. In the middle of the second week, I received a message from Monica. Just a single line. "Do you have a moment?" I waited a full hour before responding. Then I told her she could come by. She entered the room wearing the same navy jacket she used to wear on stage, but this time it didn't look like armor. It looked like memory. She didn't sit. She stood across from me and asked, "Do you really think I meant to push you out?" I didn't answer right away. Because truthfully, I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. I told her what mattered was that she did. Whether it was intentional, or structural, or cultural, or convenient, the result had been the same. I told her I didn't need her regret, I needed her to let go. She nodded once like a small wave pulling back from shore. After she left, I finally read the family messages I'd been ignoring. There were over a dozen, some angry, some pleading, one from my cousin asking if I felt proud now. I didn't respond. Because pride wasn't the feeling. It was clarity. I hadn't done any of this to be celebrated. I had done it because silence is not a strategy. And being told you don't belong doesn't mean they're right. It just means you haven't shown them what belonging actually looks like when it's built on truth. At the end of that week, I drafted one final memo. Not about compliance, not about contracts, about culture. I titled it Framework for Legacy Beyond Bloodline. It proposed a mentorship pipeline for young professionals who didn't come from wealth, who didn't carry last names with weight, who had ideas, but no allies. I pitched it as a pilot program. I knew the board would see it as symbolic. I knew some would roll their eyes. But I didn't care. Because systems don't just collapse from exposure. They transform when rebuilt with different questions. That memo wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And I knew that when the next girl walked into this building with a folder and a quiet voice, she wouldn't need to explain herself twice. Because the foundation would be different. Because I made sure of it. It took less than a month for the transition to feel irreversible. Monica's name was slowly pulled off internal documents, email signatures updated one by one, and the shadow she had once cast over the building no longer defined the rooms beneath it. The board approved my mentorship initiative without fanfare, but they didn't fight it. That alone told me enough. They were tired of defending old rules that no longer served them. Sometimes, institutions don't change because of inspiration. They change because the alternative is collapse. What surprised me most wasn't the absence of resistance. It was the silence from people who once insisted I'd never understand real business. The same executives who had once overlooked me at meetings now reviewed every document I submitted with quiet precision. Not because they feared me, but because they couldn't afford not to listen. That kind of shift isn't just structural. It's cultural. And it doesn't come from vengeance. It comes from proof. Late one evening, I stayed behind to review the onboarding flow for new clients. The office was nearly empty. The city lights outside flickered like distant applause. I opened my inbox and saw an unexpected message. It was from Caleb. No subject line, no greeting, just one line. If you'd warned me, I would have listened. I stared at it for a full minute before closing the tab. I didn't reply, not because I hated him. Because it was never my job to warn him. He had spent years learning how to read numbers but never learned to read the room. And in business, ignorance is not a defense, it's a choice. That week I scheduled one final walkthrough of the legacy infrastructure team. These were the people who worked in the background. The ones who processed compliance packets, coded back-end reports, kept the lights on without ever being called strategic. I thanked each of them by name. I told them what no one had told me 6 years ago, that work done in silence is often the spine of the entire structure. One analyst, a woman named Priya, asked me how it felt to take back what had once been denied. I told her it didn't feel like taking. It felt like returning to a place that finally recognized the cost of my absence. Around that time, invitations began arriving again. Speaking engagements, panel requests, legacy family events. I turned down most of them. Not out of bitterness but focus. Reputation doesn't build impact. Systems do. One afternoon I did agree to speak at a university roundtable for women in STEM policy. It wasn't televised. There was no media. Just 20 students and a quiet auditorium. I didn't tell them what I had built. I told them what had almost stopped me. And I watched their faces shift, not because they admired the outcome but because they recognized the beginning. That moment when you're told to shrink and you decide not to. A few days later, Kendrick, the senior board member, invited me to lunch. He didn't ask me about Orion, or the audit, or the vote. He asked me about my grandfather. What he would have thought of all this. I told him the truth. I think he would have been proud. But also surprised. Not at what I accomplished, but at how quiet it was. My grandfather believed legacy came with volume. With titles. With handshakes and thick oak tables. I believe legacy is built in the contracts people don't read carefully. in the code that holds the servers up, in the structure that survives when appearances fall apart. As I walked back to the office that afternoon, I passed by the old executive elevator, the one I wasn't allowed to use during my early years. For a second, I thought about taking it. Just once. Just for the symbolism, but I kept walking. Because what mattered now wasn't the floor I stood on. It was the foundation I had rebuilt line by line, contract by contract, without needing permission. Back upstairs, Michael, my new assistant, left a document on my desk, a revised organizational map. It showed a new reporting structure, 3 flattened hierarchies, and a clean line of communication between systems and strategy. At the bottom was a simple label, implemented by Ingrid Nilsson, Strategic Oversight Director. I smiled, not because of the title but because of what wasn't there. No watermark, no legacy stamp, no borrowed name. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day where the air is still and emails pile up faster than replies. I had just finished reviewing the second phase digital compliance rollout when a knock came at the door. It was Kendrick again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 independent board members and one person I didn't expect to see: Eleanor Weiss, the interim chair appointed after Monica stepped down. Eleanor was known in the industry for her ability to stabilize volatile companies without making noise. She had worked with failing hospitals, broken nonprofits, and post-scandal tech startups. Her presence at Nilsson and Hart was a clear message. The family name would no longer insulate bad systems. She asked if we could speak privately. No formal agenda, no presentation slides, just a conversation. I said yes. Because when people who once ignored you ask for your input without pretense, it's not about power. It's about necessity. We sat across a small conference table on the 38th floor just outside the legal wing. Eleanor began by thanking me for the structural reforms, then quickly pivoted to the question I hadn't expected. Would you consider staying beyond the transition period? I paused, not for drama but for air, because even though part of me had seen this coming, hearing it out loud shifted something quiet inside my chest. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked what staying would look like. Not in terms of title or visibility, but in terms of control. Because I wasn't interested in returning to the table they had once denied me. I wanted to know who was setting the table now. Eleanor didn't blink. She said the board was ready to dissolve the legacy succession structure entirely. That they had voted to eliminate inherited voting shares by the next fiscal year. That the company's next phase would not include the phrase "family first." I listened carefully, not for promises, but for patterns. Because systems don't change with statements. They change when people stop defending the past as if it's a person worth protecting. I told her I'd think about it. And I meant it. Because decisions made out of vindication rarely build anything worth keeping. I walked home that night instead of taking a car. The air was cold, the kind of cold that feels clean. I passed the same cafe I used to sit in years ago, headphones in, sketching out data flow diagrams on napkins because I couldn't afford a second monitor. I remembered the night Silas called me and said, "They're blind to everything behind their own logos." I remembered the day Dion found the loophole in their original vendor clause that would eventually become our leverage. None of it was glamorous. All of it was built brick by brick, in quiet, unpaid hours no one would ever clap for. That walk reminded me who I built this for. Not for them. For people like me who never got the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, I returned to the office early. I stood in the hallway just outside the executive boardroom. Empty chairs, closed blinds. That space used to intimidate me. Now it looked like any other room waiting to be redefined. I opened my laptop, drafted an email to Eleanor, and simply wrote, "Let's talk structure." Because staying wasn't about loyalty. It was about influence. And if I stayed, it would be on terms that rewrote the very bones of what Nilsson and Hart had always been. Later that day, I met with Kendrick one-on-one. He asked why I had agreed to consider the offer. I told him the truth. Because walking away would have been easy. Walking back in and fixing it was harder. And because real revenge isn't about destroying what rejected you. It's about transforming it into something that no longer requires your silence to survive. He smiled and said my grandfather would have been proud. I said maybe. Or maybe he would have just been surprised that someone could lead a family empire without ever needing the family to approve. Kendrick nodded. Not out of agreement, out of understanding. There's a difference. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the lights off, watching the skyline flicker through the window. My phone buzzed with messages I still hadn't answered. Friends asking how it felt. Colleagues offering congratulations. One from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years that simply read, "You always knew, didn't you?" I didn't reply. Some messages aren't questions, they're admissions. I poured a glass of water, pulled up the latest operational roadmap, and kept working. Not because I had something to prove, but because I finally had the authority to build without asking. And when that kind of clarity arrives, you don't chase the past for closure. You create the future that makes the past irrelevant. The first time I walked into a room as a decision maker, no one stood. No applause, no special introductions, just nods, neutral eyes, and a few awkward silences too long to be polite. I didn't mind. Because when people finally realize you're the one holding the lever, respect arrives late but heavy, and once it does, it doesn't leave. The board formalized the offer within the week. Strategic Oversight Director, full executive voting rights authority to appoint future compliance leads, and an annual review structure built around merit instead of family legacy. There was no press release, just a revised org chart sent to senior staff with my name attached to positions that used to belong to Monica, Caleb, and 3 directors who had quietly resigned after the audit. I read the memo once, then closed it. Titles never interested me, leverage did, and now I had it without needing to ask. Most people adjusted quickly. The ones who didn't were gone by the second quarter. Not fired, just edged out by systems that no longer relied on reputation to define leadership. Dion helped rewrite the contract architecture to prevent future back-channel manipulation. Silas created the monitoring layer that flagged any performance reporting overstatements in real time. Together, we replaced an ecosystem built on assumption with one built on confirmation. The irony was that no one outside the building ever noticed. To the world, Nilsson and Hart looked unchanged, but inside the spine was new. That's the part people don't talk about. Quiet revenge doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like restructuring meetings that end early because there's nothing left to argue about. It feels like hallway nods from people who used to forget your name. It feels like reviewing a budget with your initials at the bottom, not because someone gave you a shot, but because you created the numbers they now depend on. A month after the transition, Eleanor stopped by my office. She asked if I'd be open to mentoring a young analyst from another division. Her name was Mel, just out of grad school, smart but unsure where she fit. I said yes. Not because I had time, because I remembered what it felt like to walk into buildings that looked solid on the outside and hollow on the inside. If legacy is going to mean anything moving forward, it has to start with access. Mel visited the following week. She brought a notebook, asked precise questions, and took her time before speaking. I saw pieces of myself in her. Not in her style or her voice, but in the way she watched the room. Carefully, intuitively, like someone who had already learned that power isn't always held by the loudest person. Sometimes it belongs to the one reading everything in silence. After our meeting, she asked what the most important decision of my career had been. I told her it wasn't a job I took, it was the moment I stopped waiting to be chosen. That sentence landed differently. I could tell. Because people like us aren't taught to walk in and claim space. We're taught to work hard and hope someone notices. But systems built on silence rarely reward the silent. So when we build our own, we have to make them speak. That same afternoon, I received an email from Monica. No greeting. Just a sentence. I see what you've built. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. She had spent her career believing legacy came from gatekeeping. I had proven it came from groundwork. From the contracts. From the platforms. From the data you didn't put your name on because you knew it would speak louder without it. That night I walked through the building alone. The halls were quieter after hours. Offices dark, only a few motion sensors flickering on as I passed. I stopped by the boardroom. The same room where years ago I had stood holding a folder and watching Monica reject me with a smile too perfect to question. The chairs were the same. The glass walls, the polished wood. But something invisible had changed. The weight of the room, the direction of the air. Not because I had conquered it, because I no longer needed its approval to be whole. I left without turning on the lights. Some victories glow louder in the dark. 3 months into the new role, I received a text from my mother. It was short, cautious, and held more weight than she likely realized. Your uncle wants to talk about the company. I sat with it for a while before responding. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what would follow. Family only reaches out when the balance shifts. And in our family, control was never emotional. It was transactional. When I was quiet, they assumed I was compliant. When I became essential, they remembered I was blood. I agreed to meet at a small restaurant on the north side. Neutral ground, public enough to keep emotions in check. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a window seat. When my uncle walked in, he looked older than I remembered, not tired, just unfamiliar, like a man whose stories were no longer being written by him. He sat without ordering, folded his hands and got straight to the point. We'd like to invite you back to the family council. Full voting rights, full transparency, no conditions. I didn't flinch. Because when someone offers what used to be a ceiling as if it's a favor, you don't respond with gratitude, you respond with clarity. I asked why now. He said the board respected what I'd done. He said the younger generation needed someone who understood both tech and tradition. He said the family wanted to mend bridges. I listened to every word and knew none of them were the truth. What they wanted wasn't reconciliation. It was proximity to influence. And the mistake they made was thinking I still needed validation. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I told him I'd think about it. Then I asked one question. Do you remember who first taught me how contracts work? He paused, confused. Then smiled, maybe thinking it was a warm memory. Your grandfather, he said. He always made you read the fine print. I nodded. That's right. And he also taught me that fine print only matters when someone assumes you won't read it. That ended the conversation. I left the restaurant without dessert. The wind outside had picked up, but it didn't sting. It felt like movement. Like the air itself had changed shape now that I no longer walked into rooms hoping to be seen. Because the truth was, the invitation they offered came too late. Not because I was angry, but because I had already built the thing they thought they were still gatekeeping. That night, I drafted a message to the extended family email thread. The same one that used to buzz with holiday plans, baby announcements, and passive-aggressive reminders about who was hosting what. I hadn't written in that thread in nearly 6 years. Most of them assumed I had opted out, disappeared, chosen work over connection, but none of them had asked what the silence actually meant, until now. The subject line was simple. Clarification. The body was short. Just 3 sentences. I appreciate the outreach, but I no longer measure belonging by which rooms I'm invited into. I've learned to build rooms of my own. Then I hit send. No signature. No footnote. No emoji to soften the weight. Because some truths don't need decoration. They just need space. The following morning, my inbox was quiet. One cousin replied with a single word. Respect. No one else responded. And for the first time in years, I felt peace where disappointment used to sit. Because what they never understood was that exile only works on people who believe in borders. I never wanted revenge. I wanted freedom. And freedom once earned doesn't wait for approval to feel legitimate. Later that day, I reviewed the annual internal survey results. For the first time since records began, employee confidence in leadership had jumped 27%. I smiled. Not because I needed the metric, but because systems had finally begun to reflect something deeper than surface. People no longer feared being invisible. They were being seen for their impact, not their surname. That shift wasn't loud. It didn't trend. But it was happening. Just before I left the office, Michael brought in a new hire for onboarding. A young Black woman named Lila, with a background in civic engineering and a voice that didn't rush to fill silence. I introduced myself, then told her what I wish someone had told me when I started. This place won't make you feel smaller. And if it ever does, come find me. Because the rooms we build in response to exclusion don't just have to be strong, they have to be open. The last time I visited my old office on the 24th floor, the one I once shared with a rotating list of junior analysts and forgotten legacy interns, it was empty. The nameplate was gone, the walls bare, the whiteboard still faintly marked with diagrams I had drawn years ago when I still believed approval was the final step to belonging. I stood there for a full minute, not out of nostalgia but quiet closure. The version of me that used to sit in that corner and wait for feedback no longer existed. She had left the room long before her badge ever got deactivated. What replaced her was someone who didn't need visibility to create change. Someone who no longer confused access with worth. That same day, I archived the final folder in my drive labeled Compass Rebuild, a name I had chosen years ago in secret after they took Project Compass away from me. I remember thinking at the time that if they could steal the name, they couldn't steal the direction, and they didn't. Every document in that folder was built after they said I wasn't ready. Every line of code, every audit trigger, every strategic review protocol was developed not to punish them but to prove that structure outlasts sentiment. That good systems don't need defense, they need clarity. Weeks later, during a panel on ethical infrastructure contracts, someone asked me what the hardest part of my journey had been. I could have said the rejection. I could have said the silence. I could have said the nights I questioned if any of it was worth continuing. But instead, I said this. The hardest part was realizing that most rooms were built to make you grateful just to be in them. And the most important thing I ever did was stop being grateful. Not for the people, but for the illusion that my access meant progress. There was a long pause after I said it. Not because it was provocative, but because it was undeniable. You can't rebuild a system while thanking the structure that excluded you. Later that evening, I sat in the quiet corner of my apartment, watching the sun dip behind the skyline, soft orange light folding across the edge of the buildings, like the final line of a long story. My phone buzzed with another message from a former colleague. Just one sentence, I wish we'd listened sooner. I didn't reply, because listening doesn't change the past. It only defines who gets to participate in the future. And I had already made peace with the fact that not everyone who was there when you were ignored gets to be there when you lead. As spring arrived, I began mentoring a new cohort through our internal access program. They didn't look like the board, they didn't sound like Monica, they didn't ask for validation. They asked how systems break, and how to design ones that don't collapse under pressure. I gave them real numbers, real lessons. I told them the story of a company that once mistook a quiet engineer for an expendable niece, and how that mistake eventually rewrote their financial backbone. Not to glorify the moment, but to explain what happens when you treat people like risk instead of resource. On the final day of that cohort's training, one of them asked me what power feels like once you finally hold it. I didn't answer right away, because real power isn't loud. It's not about being feared or followed. It's about knowing that even if they try to erase your name, they still need your blueprint to function. I told them power feels like never having to ask twice. Power feels like not flinching when someone tries to question what you already built in silence. Power feels like building a structure that no one can lock you out of again. And if you do it right, they eventually ask you to show them how. That night, I printed out the original rejection letter Monica had sent me. I folded it once and placed it in the drawer beneath my desk. Not as a trophy, as a receipt. Proof that everything they told me I wasn't became the reason they still had a company to walk into. Because sometimes success doesn't sound like applause, it sounds like operational stability. It looks like systems that no longer ask who your family is before deciding whether you matter. And it feels like building something so undeniable they stop asking how you got here and start asking how you stayed. So let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. Have you ever been told you don't belong in a place you know you were built to improve? And if you have, what are you building now that they'll eventually have no choice but to rely on?